I'm really grateful for the Brittle Bone Society for this opportunity to share updates on clinical trials and also the European and NHS systems. And I'll divide the talks into two. And what a great start to the conference, some fantastic talks. I've got a lot of slides, but they will be put up on the website afterwards. So I've put them in mainly for content, and I will quickly go through them to orientate you as to their main messages. Next slide. So here are my declarations. Next slide. So I'm just going to touch on why we need trials for people with OI. I think it's pretty self-evident, but it'd be useful for some of you to look at where the data is coming from, what's going on, and what's on the horizon in terms of new treatments for people with OI. Next slide. So a couple of years ago, and you can see a great picture of Jenny there as well, but also patients, Elaine was there, and Heather, and from many rare diseases, and you can just see Richard Keane and Shane Clark as well. We had something called the James Lind Alliance. Next slide. And this was a system to try and understand what were the top research needs for people, adults with rare bone diseases, including osteogenesis imperfecta. And you can find all of this information online. A lot of information was needed about side effects of treatments and the best treatments. But as you can see from this list, it wasn't only focused on broken bones. People were really keen to find new treatments for other aspects of their lives that are affected by osteogenesis imperfecta. And you can see here, questions included how diseases change as people grow older and other parts of the body that are affected. So there's actually quite a number of aspects of OI that people are researching to improve treatments for. So one question I often get asked, and I get into a lot of trouble with this, is do bisphosphonates work in adults? And there's lots of different ways you can look at this, and as the speakers have already mentioned before, we really don't have big trials that were big enough to show a difference. For me, some nice data has come out from Denmark, where they looked at the number of people with OI, where you can see in the squares, who had a broken bone across their lifespan. So as you'd expect, the squares are higher than the circles, which are the general population during childhood, and then there's another little bump around the time of the menopause and in the 50s, and that was seen both in men and women. What was probably buried away in the text, in the 90s in Denmark, they had a rule. If you had OI and you had a fracture, you automatically got 5 years of bisphosphonate treatment. And what they were very careful to look at, this rule of saying everyone with OI had to go on to bisphosphonates after a fracture did not change the fracture rates, which is suggestive that the bisphosphonate improvement on fracture rates is much less than we would have thought in adults and wasn't detectable by this study. Next slide. So what's going on to address this? Well, this has led to 2 major trials, and I'll speak a little bit about a third trial, to try improving bone strength using drugs other than bisphosphonates, which is a question that came up earlier. Next slide. So the first trial is the TOPAZ study, and many of you may be involved in this. Next slide. So what are they testing? They're testing a very strong drug we have for osteoporosis called teriparatide that actually builds bone, and it works differently to drugs like alendronate, pamidronate, and zeledronate, and works more on the cells that build the bone rather than stopping the cells that break it down. And the plan is to give injections for 2 years, and then afterwards you have a single dose of zeledronate to sort of seal in the benefit. Next slide. And this is what we call a randomized control trial. And you either get on the teriparatide arm at the top, or they just follow you up with standard care. And this is done in a random way. So you can't choose which arm you're in. You just get given the arm that you're given. Next slide. And what we call the primary endpoint is a broken bone, and it's any broken bone that can be verified with an X-ray report or another clinical observation. They're also going to look at the number of breaks in the spine and the total number of fractures. And other things they'll be looking at is the impact on bone pain, quality of life, sleep, and other aspects of quality of life that people have, and comparing these results in people who are on this teriparatide and zoledronate arm compared to standard care. Next slide. So who can take part? Well, it's quite an easy study to get engaged with. If you're an adult aged over the age of 18 and have a doctor who's told you of OI, you can potentially take part. You clearly have to read the information about the study, and if you're happy, then provide consent and stick to the study protocol. They have a number of reasons for you not to go in the study. So one reason is that you're on another trial drug looking at osteogenesis imperfecta. If there's a reason you can't take the teriparatide or zoledronate because of other medical complications, and for women of childbearing age who are not using effective forms of contraception. But in the most part, most adults would be eligible for this study. Next slide. So how can you take part? Well, many of you may already be involved, and this map of the UK shows all the hospitals that are currently involved in this study. And if you see that your hospital's on this list, you can then go to them and say, look, can I take part in this TOPAZ study? If you're not sure, there's a brilliant website where you can go, just Google TOPAZ and maybe Edinburgh, and there you can click on a button called Get Involved, and it gives you all the information, including a downloadable leaflet and a link where you can email, where you can say, I'm thinking of taking part, what's the next step? And they can then guide you to the hospital that you can go to. So what about the other study that's a major study that's taking part in the UK to look at adults with OI? Next slide. This is funded by a drug company called Mereo Biopharma, and it's finished recruiting. So you can't be a new member of this study. We're now waiting for the full results. And I'll just give you a brief highlight of the study and what we found so far. Next slide. This is a scientific diagram we can look at later, but it works in a slightly different way to all the other drugs in that it really focuses on the cells that build bone. It's an antibody that removes a natural break the body has to stop bone forming. And by removing this break, bones grow very quickly. Next slide. It's a slightly more complicated design. In the previous study, you could either be given the drug or not given the drug. Here they were doing a dosing study, so you had a high dose group, a medium dose group, a low dose group, and then a placebo group. And those in the placebo group didn't get any drug, they just got an injection of salt water, a small injection of salt water, and then after a few months they were then put onto the high dose group option. And then the people were then followed up for 12 months. Next slide. So who took part? Well, quite a number of people took part. You can see the numbers in the dosing groups. You can see their age, around 4 years old, and there were slightly more women than men. And if you look at the type of OI, and I agree that we often get fixated on the type of OI, but we can generally break people down into what we call non-deforming OI, where the limbs are straight and the height isn't affected. So type 1, which is a much more severe disease. Type 3, there's a good spread of representation from these different types of OI. Next slide. So what are the key learnings? Well, many of you bone density scans, and this measures bone density in several sites. And what they found that there was a density after 6 months and 8% at 12 months, which is actually quite high. But really importantly, this increase in bone density was found in people with OI of all types, and this was very encouraging news, as there has been some research that shows that people with severe OI are onto these sort of osteoporosis medicaments. They then looked at the bone in more detail. Next slide. And this is put your arm leg in a scanner, and it actually takes a very, very close look at the bone. And here they found very strong increases in how much bone there was 1 year, a 4% increase, which is actually quite a lot. And then they can put that into an engineering model to see how that change in bone, amount of bone, changes the strength of bone. And again, they found a significant increase in the strength of bone. The real question was whether this actually changed fracture rates, and there probably weren't enough people in the study to look at that. But when they did look at the fracture rates, next slide, they found there was an indication that if you were given the higher dose of this drug, you had a lower fracture rate. So there was 15% in the high group compared to 35 and 23 in the medium and low dose groups. Not what we would call statistically significant, but encouraging the results nevertheless. Next slide. Safety is an issue, and there are some concerns about this drug use of this drug in people with osteoporosis. A different type of this drug. This drug is given by infusion, whereas other drugs are given by injection. But thankfully, while there were some what we call serious adverse events, these are events that lead to a hospitalization, they were all thought to be unrelated to the drug. So that's very reassuring. Next slide. So where are we going next with this drug? Well, they're actually going to push now for a study in children, and we'll look at the effect of this drug in children. And hopefully using that will then lead for it to being made available for doctors to use in hospitals around the world. So the focus now is they've done this confirmatory study in adults. It's now moving to the children phase. Next slide. But as we've heard already, OI is much more than a disease that causes the eyes to go blue and the hips and the bones to break and the teeth to be abnormal. It affects other parts of the body. Next slide. And what I've done here, and you can look at this at your leisure, if you can go to a site called clingov.trials, it shows all the trials that are going around the world looking at people with OI. And there are a number, there are 8 in total that are recruiting across the world. I've highlighted 2 in particular where there is recruitment within the UK. And this is a trial using a drug in osteoporosis we call denosumab, and looking at its effect in children and young adults. And the sites there are Birmingham and Bristol. And then there's a novel study looking at stem cell use. This is where you give back stem cells, which are thought to be master cells, to try and heal OI. And that's a very complicated study, and it's really looking at people before they're born, so while they're still in the womb, or maybe just after they're born, the first year of life. And that's the main site for that is Great Ormond Street. Next slide. So in summary, there are lots of trials underway. Some of you know I'm involved in something called the Rudy study, and if you do register for the Rudy study, you will be sent updates if there's a trial that's eligible for you, and that's happened for both the Topaz study and also for the Asteroid study. And I'm very encouraged by this approach. There's lots of other people working how to make trials work better in rare bone diseases than other rare diseases, and really fills us with confidence that we really have an opportunity for a brighter future for people with OI.